Okay, now, chapter 7, the relativity and ethnocentricity of human rights in Griffin's book on human rights. In section 7.1, he wants to talk about ethical relativity, which I'm just going to abbreviate by ER. And he says it makes two basic claims. Um, the first one is when you think about statements, judgments. Remember what we talked about judgments earlier. If you think about judgments, how do you unpack them? What are they? And in a previous video, we looked at, what are they just simple matters of taste? Are they rational preferences or the simple, knee-jerk preferences? And then we looked at the problems with that. And then we looked at that whole idea of problems of rationality when you bring that in, and then went to a kind of perception model and looked at that. But in the end, right, Griffin is going back to this question, like, is this just all relative, right? Relative to a culture? Is it just ethical relativity as in cultural relativity? So two claims. So that, again, going back, so now we're just going to unpack moral judgments or value judgments. They're simply evaluated with respect to an ethical framework. So I've abbreviated ethical framework as an EF. Now, you could say something very clearly. Okay, well, what's an ethical framework? What do you mean by that? Is that like a mathematical structure that you'd find at the beginning of Euclid's Elements, where it's all nicely laid out with postulates and axioms and theorems and how to derive theorems, etc., etc. Is that what you mean by an ethical framework? Is an ethical framework something like, well, we kind of reason our way through it and it's kind of, fairly loose or whatever? My point is not to solve that question, what is an ethical framework right now, but merely to say, keep it in the back of your mind that that's problematic, like a conceptual scheme. That's problematic. What is a theory? That's a problematic question. And some cases it's pretty clear, like when you have a mathematical structure, like a series of axioms and derivation rules and things like that. That's not so bad. But once you start getting away from that and talking about, like, we have a historical framework for interpretation, that's when it gets quite a bit looser. So in any case, but put that to the side, because I think we can return and say something like, sure, evaluating ethical judgments, you look at them with respect to some kind of cultural framework. That's reasonably clear for the moment. Okay, so ethical relativity says just that. That's what you're doing. You're evaluating moral claims with respect to that kind of background. Is it moral? Well, let's look at what we do here in this particular culture. And the other thing, the relativity part is so that it's relative to a culture and no ethical framework. That's these cultural frameworks, if you like, you can call them that. There's lots of them. And they're different, and they could be extremely different. They might, like if you were to look at kind of Venn diagram it, you might have them where, oh yeah, like there's one culture way over here and one's way over here. Oh, but sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they're really close, and they just differ on a few small things. Okay, Griffin doesn't think that that it's really the case that cultures are just widely incommensurate in their beliefs. But nonetheless, he's looking at the whole idea of ethical relativity at the beginning. So the argument for to get ethical relativity often goes like this, and we do this a lot in everyday life. I'm guilty of it and all that, but it's actually not a very good argument. And it goes something like this. Well, look, people argue all the time over ethics. There's just no agreement. Ethics, politics, blah. How to make moral judgments or whatever. Look, it's just where you grew up. There's so much disagreement. So the conclusion is, well, it's just a matter of where you grew up. That's a conclusion, right? So when someone says it's just a matter of what culture you're from, that's actually a conclusion. That's a strong claim. And what's the basis of that claim? Well, it's usually inferred from disagreement. Well, look, there's so much disagreement. Ethical disagreements, that's the premise. It's like, just look, it's all over the place. Therefore, ethical relativism, that's got to be the case. So that it's a premise to the conclusion. So ethical relativism is a conclusion of a particular kind of argument. And we kind of just slide over. They say, well, there's so much disagreement that, there's no truth there. Well, that's actually a tiny little argument that looks like a statement, but it's actually an argument. And it's sliding from a premise to a conclusion. And rather than sliding, it's an inference, right? It's like from disagreement, we infer no objectivity. So to abstract, it's really saying that from disagreement on something, we can infer that there's no truth of that something. Now, when you think about that, oh, you got to be kidding. Really? That's a terrible argument, because you can come up with easy counterexamples or easy examples of that structure where we would not say, well, there's disagreement, therefore there's no objective truth. So it's invalid because you could have ethical disagreements, and some people are just wrong, right? Like let's say two cultures disagree. Well, one of them could just be wrong, right? Unless you're not willing to entertain that a culture could be wrong and that all cultures are equal, well, then you're a relativist, right? So you, as we would say in the philosophy game, you're begging the whole question. Like if you just want to put your foot down and say, there's no possible way that any one culture could be right and one culture could be wrong. Like if you want to talk like that, well, have at her. But keep in mind that you are essentially asserting this. You're not arguing for it. You're just asserting it. And you may wish to hold that as a fundamental belief, like a bedrock premise, and say, no, I reject this whole thing. You could do that. And just say, no, I don't care about that. I'm going to start with the fact that cultures are all, I don't know, you could say morally equivalent or whatever, however you want to put it. You could start that like that, but then you would be asserting that. You wouldn't be proving it. You would just assert it, right? And fine, if you want to do that, but just be aware that you're making an assertion. Again, that might be right, but you're just making an assertion. Okay, so but to go back into this sort of standard kind of argument for it, that from this premise we infer this. Think about like something that could be a different conclusion, that the Earth goes, or sorry, that could be a different thing we're looking at other than moral relativity. What about a statement like the Earth goes around the sun? Well, if you look at the history of astronomy, there's a little bit of disagreement over that. So at one time, of course, it was a very lively debate amongst very well-educated people and scientists as well. So it was like theologians and scientists, and whole piles of people were divided over this question. Right? So there were some astronomers at one time that were convinced that no, the sun goes around the Earth, and they assembled their data to support that hypothesis. And of course, we all know the rather potted little story that Copernicus came along and he publishes this book, and he's kind of shy about it, but eventually Galileo comes and has all these battles with theologians. But there were also scientists that were of the time that were defending the geocentric model. So they would have said this is incorrect, that the Earth does not go around the sun. It's a geocentric model. The sun goes around the Earth. And then you have the heliocentric gang that said, no, this is true. So what did we have there? We had disagreement. We had disagreement over what you could say. And again, I know I'm raising some philosophy of science questions, and some people could jump up and down, but we'll have to put that. You're really talking about a fact. The fact is either the sun goes around the Earth or the Earth goes around the sun. Okay, so that's the framework. Now, which one is it, right? Well, there's disagreement over it. Would you then say, well, there's no truth to the matter. It's just a matter of opinion. The heliocentric people have their cultural view of the solar system, and the geocentric people have their cultural view. I don't think many people are going to accept that. A lot of people are going to say, well, I don't think that applies there. So that's the point, is that the argument doesn't do what you think it does. The argument of disagreement to no truth, that doesn't work very well. That's a weak argument. So this one, Griffin says, that's not going to work very well. Griffin also, but that, of course, the flip side, that doesn't establish because that the argument is invalid or the argument doesn't work to get this. That doesn't mean that it's disproven it. It just means that this is not a good argument for it. So I gave you a bad argument for ethical relativism, right? you could say something like, oh yeah, that was a bad argument for ethical relativism. I still think that ethical relativism is true, but I'm not going to use that lousy argument that you gave me. This one's awful. I'm going to try to come up with a different argument. That's fine. You more power to you if you want to do that, but you got to find a different argument, or you put your foot down and insist on it's true. So there are responses to the this is a bad argument for ethical relativism. Again, you could just look for a different, you could say, well, tomorrow we'll come up with a better one. Which I don't think Griffin is buying. So he says, look, that's a lousy argument for it. How about this? When I started off here, I talked about, like an ethical framework. What is an ethical framework? That's going to start getting a bit murky. But even ask yourself something like this. Have you ever been in a situation where like you're with a friend and you're having coffee or having a beer or whatever, and you get into some argument? And as you start, and you're getting it, but as you start talking, you start realizing, wait a second, I'm not sure we're really disagreeing. Sometimes we think we are disagreeing about something, and then we realize, oh, we have slightly different definitions. Like think about people arguing about abortion, right? Often they're not agreeing on certain definitions of fundamental terms. So if I have a definition of life that says one thing and you have a different definition of life, we could disagree, but we're using different terms, or you're using the same term differently. So our disagreement may not really be all that real. It might be just disagreement, not necessarily about abortion per se, but about how to define life, for instance. And sometimes, people will shift their views if they go, yeah, I used to think of life as this, and though I held that position, but now I've changed my definition of what I think life is all about. So I'm going to accept a different argument. So that's kind of like people talk disagreement, really, like that might have been at cross purposes. Is it a real disagreement? Yeah, but it's not really a disagreement what you might think it is. It's a disagreement over semantics. So you got to be careful. Sometimes things can look like big disagreements, but someone might say, well, if that's how you define life, yeah, I would agree that your argument works, but I define it this way, and that's how this goes. And then you're actually not arguing about really abortion. You're arguing about, you thought you were arguing about abortion, but you're arguing about the definition of life. That's one, keep that in mind, that sometimes disagreements really aren't what they seem. And sometimes disagreements are not necessarily even really any disagreement. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to borrow, a real old sort of discussion of this. It's kind of quasi-history. So all you historians out there, I'm not really passing this off as accurate history. I'm just giving a way to think about it to get at the logic of the argument. You could say something like this. I'm not sure that a lot of the ethical disagreements that are out there are really disagreements about values. I'm not convinced of that. Why not? Well, think of this. You could have two cultures, and just for the sake of discussion, I'm going to call one Athens and one Sparta. So the A is going for Athens and S for Sparta. Athens doesn't practice infanticide. Okay, so these are ancient cultures, and Athens doesn't do that. But Sparta practices infanticide. Okay, would you immediately say, oh, that's a big disagreement there? Wow, one culture practices infanticide and the other doesn't. And it's practice, it's part of the culture. That's got to be very different ethical frameworks. That's huge. That's like Venn diagram. You're on this side of the room, and you Spartans are way over there. Well, hold on for a sec. How about if I said something like this? I gather the Athenians and the Spartans, and I say, okay, who doesn't love their kids? Does everybody love their kids here? And everybody, yeah, sure. Even the Spartans are like, you bet we love our kids. Now, so they might share the same value of loving their kids and all, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you might want to you could dig in and say, well, what do you mean by love, right? Okay, these things go on and on for forever. But let's just kind of close that one off and think about it. Like, okay, they both love their kids, and they're both saying this in good faith. But do they necessarily have different ethical frameworks if you find out that the Athenians live in the land of plenty. They never have to worry about food. They never have to make tough choices about scarcity, right? Like the harvests are always bountiful. There's plenty of all the foods that they like and all the good nutritious foods. No issues there. So if think about it. So if you have a big family, if you end up having more kids, you thought you were going to have one, you have triplets or something like stuff like that. Well, so what? There's lots of food to go around. In the winter, don't worry, we got lots of stored food. If you're a little sick and you can't work for a while, there's a surplus of food. Your labor taken out of the labor force, there's still lots of food. That doesn't force us into any choices. And you're sick and you need more food. We got lots, right? Well, if the Athenians are in that, they're just going to, yeah, well, no problem. But think about it if you're a Spartan and you have to make tough choices, like you have unexpectedly you have more kids than you think. You thought you were going to have one kid and triplets come along, and one of them is really sick. One and the other two are moderately sick. And if you give as much food, you can see where this is going. You give as much food as the sick kid needs, you're really going to endanger the others. I'm not saying what the right answer is. All I'm saying is that you may be faced because of empirical conditions with much, much more difficult choices than those Athenians. Well, they get everything, right? They're just living and laughing over there. And we Spartans we have to make the really hard choices. Winter's coming, all kinds of nasty stuff. Okay, so you could say something like this. The Spartans might say, hey, look, we love our kids too. We don't go around killing them. That's, so this, you shouldn't say that that's the case. It's just that an ethical framework is not simply the ideas or on values. An ethical framework is a practice, and that includes empirical conditions as well. So in that sense, there really isn't an ethical disagreement here, because if we took and had the same kind of empirical conditions for the groups, then this, so if empirical conditions were the same, this practice, which is part of the Athenian life and not part of the Spartan life and not part of Athenian life, that would disappear. Then what would you say? Well, you'd have to say, well, I guess that really wasn't part of the ethical framework. It was, maybe we should think of ethical frameworks as ideas and empirical conditions. So, and Griffin is getting at, yeah, like, if there is evidence that as empirical conditions start to look very similar, people's values, they don't have to make hard choices with respect to them. All of a sudden, things start looking very similar. And Griffin argues in several places in the book that, as you look at how the world's of course, there's great disparities. That's not the point, but which is terrible. But in the places that were further away in terms of their ethical frameworks, they look behaviorally closer as their empirical conditions become more and more similar. So that's an interesting point. And so, but that for Griffin is like, well, you know what? Let's not get too carried away with this whole notion of ethical relativity. There are grounds to think that it's based on a bad argument, and there are grounds to think that it's based largely on non-moral attributes like empirical situations. Now, but the question is okay, what about human rights? How do they fit into all of this? Okay, so stay tuned. We'll get to that.